Harvard and Berkeley alumnus. First is there. Again, the website, the nationalparkhistory.com. And he's a teacher of teaches the history of national parks and environmental. And then batting cleanup, we have Rich Piccarreto. Rich Piccarreto works as a tour guide for the town of Concord, Robin's House, Wright Tavern, as well as Thoreau Farm. And he's the membership coordinator of the Thoreau Society. He lives in Snowden. So without further ado, the Dr. Panels.
Oh, you guys are out of order. Here we go. Sorry. There you go.
Hi, everyone. Those are on this side of the room. You can squeeze over there. I could actually make eye contact. So Thoreau was a Concordian of the events leading to the Revolutionary War, altering the course of the life of his grandfather Jane, as we heard this morning from Groves. Thoreau was born, as he says, in the nick of time, but also in the fortuity of place. In 1837, he wrote, "I first saw the light in the quiet village of Concord of revolutionary memory. To whatever quarter of the world I may wander, I shall deem it my good fortune that I hail from Concord North Bridge. Though bodily I have been a member of Harvard University, heart and soul I have been far away. Those hours that should have been devoted to study have been spent scouring the woods and exploring the lakes and streams of my native village." His irascibility aside, because he studied and he sauntered, no Thoreau's claim on the North Bridge, as well as on woods, lakes, and streams. Love of country, yes, so he had, as you know, thoughts that were murder to the state, but also patriotism as love of land, of place. I must say that we meet the ghosts of many other wars trudging across Thoreau's pages, wars actuals and more metaphorical, but no less devastating. The depredations of the New England ecosystem, the United States intervention in Mexico, as Mexicans call it, the wars, both soft and hard, against indigenous people, and the various events that would reach critical mass in what Frederick Douglass called the slave holders' rebellion, came to count for much more than the Revolutionary War or its Arabian imaginary. In what follows, I read the double valence of Thoreau's Amor Patriae with heritage tourism in mind. About the Revolutionary War, he does so with the consciousness that every landscape is a palimpsest, composed of layers of other than human and human history. And today, the palimpsestuousness of a place is signaled by the brown signs of heritage. Broadly speaking, heritage denotes any human-made artifact thought worth preserving from castle factories. It also denotes the intangibles of culture, such as oral traditions, folkways, and foodways. A landscape becomes a heritage landscape through official designation, as well as public participation and repeated ritual, historical reenactments, for example. Some see heritage as a general good that should be inclusive and accessible. Others insist that heritage is the property of a particular people. Too often, heritage tourism, in its most nationalist form, constitutes a monolithic identity while suppressing multiplicities. I should add that indigenization, not the undoing we associate with decolonization, but the redoing and the adding of indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing upends the Eurocentric notion of heritage that Americans inherited. In the 19th century, the word tourist described Americans who took to the sights of Europe or natural beauties like Niagara Falls. However, as Americans began to go on pilgrimage in their own country, the tourist became a heritage tourist. Improved roads and new railroad lines made travel much easier. Tourism began to take shape as the commercial enterprise that we know today. Many Americans, as their wealth increased, could indulge in what Thorsten Veblen in 1899 called vicarious leisure. Tourists were in searching destinations. The rise of American heritage tourism tracks the rise in the concept of an American national identity. Americans began to make visible in the landscape their claims to that landscape, building monuments and marking battle sites. Americanizing the land took many forms, as Thoreau recognized in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Emerson wrote Concord hymn for the dedication of the obelisk of the North Bridge on April 19, 1837, and a few months later, he gave his lecture, The American Scholar. Tourists now had a destination that celebrated American heroes and a way to think about them. Concord became monumental, may I say, and became a heritage landscape in itself, and Thoreau has been turned into an heritage icon. Heritage creates imagined communities in which members participate, but rarely meet face to face. However, one place where people can come together is the museum. The artifacts that constitute the material history of Concord were first collected by a quirky neighbor of Thoreau's, Cummings E. Davis. His collection forms the core of the Concord Museum holding. The museum owns a British cartridge box dated 1775, but Thoreau gave to Davis, as you see here. Thoreau writes, "We cut down the few old oaks which witnessed the transfer of the township from the Indian to the white man and commenced our museum." Thoreau palimpsests and bitterly. Musket balls as well. David Wood told me that it is said that Thoreau found them while plowing a field owned by Emerson. All we know is that the musket balls were a gift of the children of Daniel Rickinson to the museum, and I would love to hear your thoughts about these musket balls. I think, as you may be, of Thoreau's ability to find arrowheads, artifacts that memorialize the presence and then the absence of the first people of Concord. Can find a remnant of the original bridge on display at the Concord Museum, and apparently several Concordians own pieces of the bridge given to them as school children to mark the 1975 bicentennial. The original bridge endures as a relic or a fetish. The bridge where provincials met the British was built in 1760 and required the work of 28 laborers, some of them abutters on the river, as well as men enslaved by Timothy and Nathan Billers. The Billings would later fight with Captain William Smith's company in 1775. This bridge was replaced in 1788, and with persistent lobbying from the wily Ezra Ridley, who had his own plans for memorializing April 19, a new bridge was built downriver in 1793. There was no bridge on site until 1874, when in anticipation of the 75th anniversary of the Concord fight, the Centennial Bridge was built and David French's Minuteman added. This bridge was replaced by the 1910 commemorative bridge, a wonder of the emerging technology of reinforced concrete. Still, it could not withstand a hurricane, and in 1955, the bridge was severely damaged. After this, Concord citizens pledged to use lumber and, quote, to reproduce as far as anyone knows, the bridge of 1819, 1775. I love that, as far as anyone knows. It speaks to the desire for an authenticity that can never be achieved, that aura that Walter Benjamin attributes to original artifacts. Musket balls and bridge parts and arrowheads are things that beckon, that function as small wormholes connecting us to other places and times. As my brief biography of the bridge attests, there was no bridge in Thoreau's day. For Thoreau to refer to the North Bridge was to conjure up an absence. You may recall what Thoreau said in Slavery in Massachusetts. The inhabitants of Concord are not prepared to stand by one of their own bridges. No, they were not. In 1854, as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, the North Bridge had been abandoned by its genius Messiah. But for Thoreau, the bridge was never a material thing, but a metonym for an idea. In an early journal entry, Thoreau declared that he does not want to walk in procession with pomp and parade. Thoreau may have had the often rancorous planning for that university in mind when he knows the Concordians are on a committee of arrangement. In the next century, Thoreau once again panels us, but in wonder. Can we believe when beholding this landscape covered with snow, that the grain was waving in the fields and the apple trees were in blossom April 19, 1775? In the next, the robins singing and the guns firing and the bells ringing are all of the patriotic piece that Thoreau. And then finally, Thoreau rises early to paddle the Assabet. He ends his entry of parchment drawings. I detect a small jest. Spring is marked by celebrating the conquered fight, the return of peace, and the martial adjacent mating behavior of some members of the family they see on a dime. Later that year, Thoreau visited the formidable abolitionist Mrs. Mary Brooks. He examined a beautifully rendered copy of one of Amos Doolittle's engravings of the event of April 19. Enumerates all the buildings that he recognizes. His gaze moves left to right and then into the middle distance, finally landing on the hilly horizon. He expresses little interest in the painting as a depiction of the inciting event of the revolution. Rather, the soldiers are often orienting for its excursion into the Concord of 79 years ago. But before the North Bridge spanned the Concord, the site was a seasonal campsite for indigenous people. Solomon, elder of the Massachusetts tribe as Pontapog, in dialogue with Thoreau as she usually tells us. I give her the last word. There are places that are supposed to be significant. They're intentionally set up to make you feel like, okay, this is someplace special. I should show respect for it, not necessarily the place, but the idea. On seeing the North Bridge, as a Black Native woman, was more taken by the beauty of the landscape, seeing the land and looking at the river, and knowing that my ancestors certainly paddled down that river multiple times over multiple centuries. And to me, the North Bridge was irrelevant. We are surrounded by a history that has a lot of mythology, valuing equality, freedom, community. How do we take those myths? Evolutionary and forever. Thank you.
September 7, 1846, Henry David Thoreau left his cabin by Walden Pond to visit Maine's Mount Katahdin, the second highest summit in New England. We know why Thoreau went to Walden. He tells us, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts. The Katahdin excursion undertaken during Thoreau's residence at Walden was animated by the same commitment to fronting essential facts. In Maine, however, living deliberately brought him to a far wilder wilderness than he had ever known before. That experience has led to a decades-long discussion among scholars about the effect that Katahdin had in Thoreau. Some argue that a wimpy Henry David Thoreau was, well, scared shitless by the Maine wilderness, while others claim that he knew exactly how to understand and describe this new experience. All agree that on this, Katahdin nurtured in Thoreau a personal revolution in his understanding of wilderness. Today, we will explore two facets of this topic. We will accompany Thoreau in his own words in the Mount Katahdin Journey, and then we will review the scholarship about the Katahdin encounter, and I will offer my own interpretation. The first part of the journey was simple: by train and steamboat to Bangor, Maine, accompanied by a cousin. and then farther into the interior to a remote homestead. Through George McCausland, a retired boatman and lumberman, ran a small farm. McCausland agreed to accompany the travelers to Katahdin and persuaded a hardy neighbor, Thomas Fowler, to join the party. With 2 strong and knowledgeable boatmen, travel upriver could begin. Propelled by long poles in the hands of skilled boatmen, the voyagers shot up the rapids like salmon, Thoreau writes, the water rushing and roaring about us. Far from troubled by this experience, Thoreau found the rapids exhilarating. While others got out of the boat and walked cautiously around the most dangerous rapids, Thoreau stayed with the craft. In an especially difficult stretch of rapids, the man at the bow leapt toward a rock with a line, miscalculated, and fell into the water. He climbed back into the boat and quickly threw the line to Thoreau, who jumped onto a rock. I held the boat, Thoreau writes, while the man in the bow reset his pole, and then all 3 of us forced the boat upward. They worked their way upstream across a chain of lakes, singing boat songs along the way. As the party camped close to the mountain, a restless Thoreau arose in the night and beheld Katahdin looming ahead in the moonlight. The next morning, he and his companions had tied their boat to a tree, swung the extra baggage to a tree top, and began walking toward the mountain. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, in view of the summit, the weary party decided to camp beside a mountain stream. While his companions were preparing for bed, an eager Thoreau decided, he tells us, to improve the little daylight that was left by climbing the mountain alone. He pulled himself up a narrow ravine beside the river and climbed up cliffs by the roots of firs and birches. At the head of the falls, he walked over the tops of spruce trees tightly packed between huge boulders. Certainly, Thoreau writes, the most treacherous and perilous country I ever traveled. Having slumped, scrambled, rolled, bounced, and walked by turns over the scraggy country, I arrived upon a side hill. This brought me to the skirt of a cloud and bounded my walk that night. Back at camp, Thoreau joined his companions for a restless night of sleep in the rough ground. He writes, in the morning we all set off together to make our way up the falls, but soon my companions were lost to my sight behind the mountain ridge in my rear. Thoreau continues, the mountain seemed a vast aggregation of loose rocks, as if sometime it had rained rocks. It reminded me, Thoreau continues, of the creations of the old epic and dramatic poets of Atlas, Vulcan, Cyclops, and Prometheus. It was vast, titanic, and such as man never inhabits. Some part of the beholder seems to escape through the loose grating of his rib as he ascends. He is more alone than you can imagine. Vast, titanic, inhuman nature has got him at a disadvantage. She seems to say sternly, why came ye here before your time? Soon afterwards, Thoreau turned back to rejoin his companions. Together they headed down the mountain, hoping to reach their boat before dark. Along the way, they walked through a region that Thoreau calls the burnt lands. Here he continued his ruminations. This was primeval, untamed, and forever untamable nature. Here was no man's garden, but the unhandled globe. It was matter, vast, terrific. We walked over it with a certain awe. Here I was shown some star's surface, some hard matter in its home. I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. Think of life in nature, daily to be shown matter, to come in contact. Rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense, contact. Who are we? Where are we? What are we to make of Thoreau's encounter at Katahdin? 2 of my favorite authors, Bill Bryson and Robert Nash, argue mistakenly that the answer is simple. Thoreau was scared witless by a real wilderness. Bill Bryson, who quit his Appalachian Trail hike about 100 miles before Mount Katahdin, claimed Henry David Thoreau thought nature was splendid, but at Katahdin he was unnerved to the core. And in Wilderness in the American Mind, Robert Nash claims that a near hysterical Thoreau was robbed of his capacity for thought. These statements are, of course, nonsense. It should be apparent from Thoreau's narrative that it was hardly the wilderness wuss alleged in these critiques. Remember that he had ridden a boat up the Wallace Rapids, and when his colleagues had settled down for the night on the south of Katahdin, he ventured alone high up on the mountain, and the next morning he climbed so quickly that he left the others far behind. Wilderness wuss, give me a break. In contrast to these detractors, Laura Walls gives Katahdin the attention it deserves. In Henry David Thoreau, A Life, she makes this remarkable statement about his burnt lands ruminations. It was, she writes, the most pivotal and most emotional passage in all of Thoreau's work. The most pivotal and most emotional passage in all of Thoreau's work. Some see in his contact statement only terror and alienation. Thoreau saw here his limit point, his bedrock truth. But despite flinching, he embraced it. What possesses him, she continues, he will fully possess. Thoreau's response is to reach out, touch back, body to body, contact. On Katahdin, Thoreau found his truth. It was deep, even bottomless, yet deeply intimate and familiar, and unutterably wild. I embrace Laura Wall's emphasis on the wild, but there's more to say. If we do, as we should, take seriously Thoreau's words about Katahdin, we need to begin by recalling that he wrote them long after returning to Walden. He took some notes while in Maine, and he remembered well his impressions at Katahdin. But giving those words, those feelings, words and paragraphs came later. And although he tells us that Katahdin spoke to him, in reality, of course, the mountain never talked. Nor did a helpful sign in the mountain declare, "Dear traveler, consider that the scenes you are witnessing were foretold long ago in the classical stories of Atlas and Prometheus." These references were pure Thoreau, of course. It came long after he climbed the mountain. And here I can't resist adding that in contrast to current national park policies, there is no signage at Katahdin indicating that visitors should note any disparaging remarks about America and report them forthwith to President Cohen. Thoreau's words about that experience were his own, but where do they come from and what do they mean? What he took from Katahdin was not a complete text, but a genuine set of feelings on which to ruminate and from which to create. How should he describe the Katahdin experience? Back at Walden, he spread his notes on his desk, began writing. In effect, he needed to take his own advice on self-analysis and become the Lewis and Clark, the student of his own inner streams and oceans. From what we can tell, he explored and wrote about his Katahdin impressions in two phases. During the fall of 1848, 2 years after he left the mountain, published in the Urban magazine an essay called The Ascent of Katahdin. In it, he published his initial ruminations on the vast, titanic character of the mountain. But the bird land section did not appear in print until after Thoreau's death in 1864. So he had a long time to think about and craft his famous passage about contact. While writing about Katahdin, Thoreau had with him a companion, so to speak, in the person of Edmund Burke, the British philosopher who wrote a treatise in 1757 called Philosophical Inquiry into the Sublime and the Beautiful. Thoreau read Burke's treatise, and while at Harvard, he wrote an essay about it, so he knew Burke well. In his inquiry, Burke described a set of objective experiences that he claimed to trigger reactions that lead to something called the sublime. To a remarkable degree, Burke provides a roadmap for understanding Thoreau's Katahdin experience. For Burke, the objective triggering experience for the sublime include encounters with vastness, solitude, and obscurity. Thoreau and Katahdin, check, check, and check. The possible subjective responses include terror, awe, and insignificance. Again, in Thoreau's case, check, check, check. Thus, in his essay on Katahdin, Thoreau was reporting a profound experience of the sublime. And I might add here that in working on this paper and studying what people had said in the past about the sublime, and it gets very confusing, very convoluted, and very varied. And so I began thinking about my own experiences of the sublime, such as they've been. And basically, if you came near me in the last couple of weeks, I was going to ask you about your own experiences of the sublime. Did this with my grandchildren, my hairdresser, on the plane out here from Spokane. I would have done it with the pilots if I could have gotten into the cockpit. But it's very interesting what people come up. At any rate, Thoreau's Katahdin encounter was for him a personal revolution. But a revolution should be more than just a momentary experience. In the words of the song, was this an earthquake or was it a shock? Was it good turtle soup or merely the mock? So the question arises, was Thoreau's response to the unutterably wild Katahdin the real Nicole? Did it endure? Or was it a singular experience, a one-off, without a long-lasting impact? To address this question, let's turn again to the sublime. As described by Burke and others, the sublime is a concept describing experiences that are awe-inspiring, overwhelming, and beyond ordinary comprehension. Short and mysterious, often evoking both wonder and fear. And yet they leave the rational mind intact, able to endure the incomprehensible thoughtfully. As powerful as was Thoreau's experience on Katahdin, he did indeed engage it thoughtfully. He was hardly, as Robert Nash claimed, robbed of his capacity for thought. In 1857, more than a decade after leaving the mountain, Thoreau wrote a friend, Harrison White, are nourishing. Katahdin experience nurtured in Thoreau a capacity and a taste for engaging the unknown, the wild. In the conclusions of Walpole, drawing on essential facts from Walden Pond, but also surely from Mount Katahdin, he writes the following lines. We can never have enough of nature and must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor, vast and titanic features. We need to witness our own limits transgressed in sunlight pasturing freely where we never wander. Does the Katahdin revolution appear in Thoreau's other writings? Yes. Thoreau came to embrace the wild as a challenging but authentic member of the family of essential facts he was pursuing in Walden. In Walden, he was enchanted with studying the mysteries of nature. Witness, for example, his enthusiasm for probing by the hour the hidden ways of a loon, or a battle between ants at his doorstep. Mysteries to explore. Thoreau's Katahdin experience was a kind of boot camp in the art of engaging the unknown. Contact. As he wrote Harrison Blake, mountains like Katahdin, places for which we draw nourishment. That nourishment, that taste for the unknown, could be found beside a small pond, as well as on a great mountain. Or as Thoreau wrote in Walking, life consists in wildness. In wildness is the preservation of the world.
Revolutions are waves, not particles. The observer traces the elements of the next revolution rising from the trough of the former. In the process of memorializing the American Revolution at Charlestown, our first commercial railroad was born. 3 miles long and pulled by horses, it was laid out in a straight line from Quincy to Neponset to move blocks of granite in 1826, $50,000. Revolutions are always about money. The definition of locomotive, motive meaning money, loco meaning crazy, crazy money. Revolutions are unstoppable, just like railroad trains. It would be 6 more years before the first railroad death in Quincy, a passenger thrown 35 feet into a ravine after a cable snapped and a car gave way. Quote, revolutions are never sudden, said Henry. Not one man nor many men in a few years or generations suffice to regulate events and dispose mankind for the revolutionary movement. Death is intrinsic and fundamental to revolution. Revolutions are terminal, which what happens to be what we call the place where the train finally comes to a stop. Emerson wrote Thoreau in England, 1847, quote, at Liverpool, where I was, the clocks were put forth 12 minutes on account of the railroads. The lapping canal waters, once churned by commercial transport in Massachusetts, quickly became stagnant and smooth as glass, soon filled with duckweed and water lilies instead. Loami Baldwin, engineer of the Middlesex Canal in the 1790s, was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. His son, Loami Baldwin Jr., engineered the next generation's railroad tracks alongside his father's canals. In one transportation revolution was born in the next. 1835, the first steam engine replaced horses. Locomotive boilers hissed while passing by old town taverns and hotels, leaving a wake of swirling, disappearing steam. People no longer stopped there for the night. Oh. Both commerce and the common man moved swiftly past at 15 miles an hour toward Belchertown, which was suddenly a place. Belchertown. The new roads, quote unquote, were laid out in dry land canal, blasted and hand dug. Henry called these graded straight line scars in the earth cuts, and juxtaposed to poor laborers living along them with Mr. Hoare, Squire of Concord, himself seen walking the cut. Quote, it was something quite novel to see him there, he wrote. It would no doubt seem to him very improper, not to say undignified, to walk on the railroad. Emerson, in a letter to his lawyer, Abel Adams, detailed how railroad dividends became his daily spending money seasonally, when not lecturing. Men of means had incorporated the Fitchburg Railroad at Charlestown in 1842, and by 1843, service ran to Waltham, by 1844 to Concord. Mary Merritt Brooks of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society invited friends from Boston to a meeting in Concord and wrote, quote, you know, we shall have our railroad in full operation long before that time, and the ride from Boston to Concord will be a mere nothing. Nothing that is but a serious risk to life and limb. Weekly stories about the death and destruction wrought by the railroads were nationally syndicated, appealing to the public's gruesome fascination. The Massachusetts legislature soon required railroad companies to include details of accidents in their yearly reports. Henry's journal reads, yesterday I walked under the murderous Lincoln Bridge, where at least 10 men have been swept dead from the cars within as many years. I looked to see if their heads had indented the bridge, if there were sturdy blows given as well as received, and if their brains lay about. That bridge just south of Walden was one of the deadliest in the state. In a 9-week span in 1850, the Fitchburg Railroad recorded September 7, 1850, a brakeman was killed by a bridge between Concord and Lincoln while standing on top of the cars. October 14, 1850, a brakeman on the Fitchburg Railroad named Eugene, a Frenchman, was knocked from the downward freight train by a bridge near Concord on Monday afternoon and instantly killed. November 12, 1850, a brakeman was killed by a bridge in Lincoln while standing on top of the cars. Thoreau describes this bridge along with another in Concord as, quote, our modern dragons of Wantley, buccaneers of the Fitchburg Railroad, they lie in wait at the narrow passes and decimate the employees. The Vermont mother commits her son to their charge, and when she asks for him, again, the directors say, I'm not your son's keeper. Go look beneath the ribs of the Lincoln Bridge. Revolutions recall gallows and guillotines, and Henry notes with sardonic detachment, quote, here they are killed without priest, and the bridge, unlike the gallows, is a fixture. The days of the gallows are numbered. The next time this county has a smith to dispose of, they only have to hire him out to the Fitchburg Railroad Company. Let the priest accompany him to the freight train, pray with him, and take leave of him there. In 1842, the Farwell v. Boston Railroad case established the quote, fellow servant rule, which prevented railroad workers from recovering damages for on-the-job injuries. The railroad companies were absolved of any quote, duty of care. And once this was codified, the railroad revolution exploded. The Boston Traveler printed the following statistics in 1848, tallying the train casualties so far that decade. 42 passengers killed, 69 injured, 75 employees killed, 72 injured, and so on. Are both terrific and terrific. 6, 1852, Concord's Middlesex Freeman newspaper featured an op-ed entitled Railroads. Quote, at present, railroad companies are the most lawless things in the world. The grievances go on multiplying in number and extent until there comes a breakdown of tremendous character. Half a score of persons are killed, twice as many more or less injured. The train is smashed up. Strange as it may appear for all this loss of life, maiming, fright, and destruction of property, no one is to blame or can be made to appear blameworthy. When it comes to revolutions, no one and everyone is responsible. At the same time, in England, a railroad company began offering passengers optional one-day life insurance policies. From the Sounds chapter of Walden, quote, when I hear the iron horse make the hills echo with his snort like thunder, shaking the earth with his feet and breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils, I am refreshed and expanded when the freight train rattles past me. What was at first seen, heard, and felt as an assault on the senses soon became background noise, a part of the soundscape of Concord's rural days and nights. Henry wrote, quote, the startings and arrivals of the cars are the epochs in a village day. Once a village had a depot, it became a town. And it wasn't long before the railroad became a part of the landscape. Quote, already these puddles on the railroad reflecting the pine woods remind me of summer lakes, Henry wrote. And more from the journal. Quote, the steam whistle at a distance sounds even like the hum of a bee in a flower. So man's works fall into nature. And, quote, as I sat looking out the window the other evening just after dark, I saw the lamp of a freight train, and nearby, just over the train, a bright star, which looked exactly like the former, as if it belonged to a different part of the same train. It was difficult to realize that one was a feeble oil lamp, the other a whirl. Or this quote, quote, the cars do not make much noise, or else I am used to it. And now whizzes the boiling, sizzling kettle by me, in which the passengers make me think of potatoes, which a fork would show to be done by this time. Revolutions changed perceptions of time and space. When Henry was informed he no longer had borrowing privileges at the Harvard Library for living outside a 10-mile radius of the school, he earnestly argued to the school's president that the railroad had destroyed the old scale of distance, and Concord was now handier to Harvard than the outlying districts of Cambridge had been just a few years before. Henry's permanent library privileges were reinstated. The trains didn't only come to Henry. Henry went to the trains. In 1849, he wrote to his cousin George Thatcher in Maine, quote, I lately spent a day at the repair shop of the Eastern Railroad Company, East Boston, and at Hinckley and Drury's in Boston, the largest locomotive manufactury in this country. They turn out 7 a month, worth from $8,000 to $9,000 a piece. Train fares cost 70 cents to 90 cents locally. $25 would get you from Boston to Chicago at a time when manual labor paid about $1 a day. Henry noted he could walk to Fitchburg faster than a person who had to work all day and then take the train there. With time, the perceived distance tracks. Quote, the railroad is civilization shooting off in a tangent into the forest, Henry writes from Maine. Walter Harding wrote that Thoreau and Ellery Channing hiked to Monadnock in 1852 and similarly set their compass and started off on a straight line across fields, through forests, over brooks and swamps, stopping for nothing. Legend has it that they once found a farmhouse in their way, went in the open front door, down the hall, out the back, leaving the astonished farmer and his family speechless around the dinner table, like a railroad train. Ultimately, the observer and the revolution merge. Quote, the men on the freight train who go over the whole length of the road bow to me. As an old acquaintance, they pass me so often, and I think they take me for an employee. And am I not? Channing eventually tells of one of Henry's dying dreams. Quote, he reported a pitiful dream he had of being a railroad cut, where they were digging through and laying down the rails, the place being in his lungs. Do we ride on our revolutions, or do our revolutions ride on us? The railroad rides on us, Henry asserted, and the sleepers, the railroad ties, each one is a man, an Irish man or a Yankee man. Decades ago, the internet revolution grew exponentially after bundles of fiber optic cable were laid just a few feet off of all the major railroad lines in the United States. The revolution we're a part of today does not whine or squeal or belch or smoke and steam. It responds to our inquiries in our own language. When we ask about its potential to become the next deadly revolution, it warns us about itself. Autonomous weapons, massive job displacement, misinformation, manipulation, surveillance, and social control. Once again, terrific and terrific. Thank you.
Shouldn't. Yeah.
I vote for Bill. I want to commend you for your take on Nash's point in particular. I wondered when you were thinking about the word content. Did you think about that word as an exclamation? Did you think about the sort of the way in which the word might have been used 80 a lot? Logically, we were considering how it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit a something that had written much later in response to this I don't know, and engage the natural world that Thoreau experienced with tough.
I think that's a good question, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know. And let me just build on that a little bit. There are certain parts of this, the two Katahdin statements that I find very hard to fathom. For example, when he says that it felt as if something was coming out of his ribs. I've just never had that experience, so I don't kind of know what that would be like. And it's hard for me really to see what he means by coming back. And the way I'm interpreting it, it's something to study. And whereas others like Nash were saying, he's afraid at that point. I see that as something to study. If I could add on Nash, as I mentioned, he's a favorite author. I use it in several of my classes, his Wilderness in the American Mind. And his basic argument is we start historically in primitive times with human beings scared to death of nature and hating nature, wanting to conquer. And then slowly we begin to get to where we are in the 19th and 20th centuries with appreciation of nature. And he sees Thoreau as sort of a middle ground where he's beginning to like nature, but he's really afraid of real wilderness. So in Nash's point of view, he's a bit of a wilderness witch. He hasn't made the full transition. But that's why it's sort of part of his thesis that he has to put Thoreau in that particular box. Sorry not to answer your question specifically, but if you can figure it out, let me know. I think even though Laura Walls praises that statement as being central to Thoreau's writing, I'm not sure she really gives it kind of words to transition it. This whole business of what is the sublime? There are a lot of different thoughts been written about it, and there are lots of examples of it out there, and they're all over the place as to what exactly that means and the different language used to describe it. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So I was in my recent trip to the Fox, and I'm a certain there, so I'm looking. And the experience of being in the Rockies was for me, and I was on a book. So it was really there, but the experience for me was at once terror and I would consider that to be something akin to smile. But I'm also thinking of the spirits. And the feeling that I understand is that our bodies will produce adrenaline. And we will experience that in human beings. So I could be at once thrilled and exalted and terrorized. And it just is a matter of my interpretation, which over time changed because I started reading about early experiences of explorers in the Pacific Northwest. And now they decided to go forth. They didn't retreat, they didn't really care. And so I decided consciously to go and to take what I could. And so I think that whatever it was that Thoreau was feeling was script was that other sensation that's feeling on your heart coming through your chest or your lungs collapsing or some kind of bodily experience of in response to something that was so powerful. And he was not,
Right. Well, and overwhelming is kind of a key word for
Yeah.
the science or the philosophy, the psychology of the sublime, what it is. Bert makes a big point. By the way, his essay has the words sublime and beautiful. And he says that beautiful is kind of just the poor cousin to the sublime. Sublime is much more powerful. And he did emphasize terror as being part of it. Thoreau in that Harvard essay said he liked the idea of the sublime, but he didn't feel like fear or terror really was part of it. But I think probably on Katahdin, there was that overwhelming sense, and that often those two do tend to go together, being just taken completely out of what you're accustomed to. Just a quick note, from that point of view, Bryson and Nash are correct that Thoreau was somewhat terrified, or at least felt very powerful emotions. It's just that from their point of view, he felt that way and ran home to mother to get the laundry done. Whereas in the philosophy, the psychology of the sublime, and in Thoreau's own experience, well, he went home, took his ideas, wrote about it, thought about it, and from there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I'm Al Howell, I've never could talk a lot in many years. When you get up where he was up on the tableland up there, in bad weather, and you're by yourself, and there was once, then you came back the second time, and it's a mile to get up above the tree from there to get to the top, and he turned around and he came back down, and then if you go, he was just a month ago. 58-year-old man, 28-year-old daughter, they climbed up the same way up the A-ball, and they got up near the summit, and it got really foggy, and they both lost their lives. It is really, this wilderness is really what anybody who thinks that he's a wood is just but I have a question is about Mount Washington. You know, he also climbed Mount Washington. Apparently, there's nothing that he wrote, any notes on it, on script.
I looked into that, and said, climb Mount Washington, that was it. I can't remember when no big deal. Took on 5 days worth of mountaineering, like 4 races.
It you don't see it in management. But if you drew the range, it is interested in cloud formation. It's also.
Yeah. Bert says that terror is the rule principle of the sublime. It's on the essay. Thoreau says that reverence, not terror, is the rule principle of the sublime. As I see. And it's the difference between the experience of the mountain, the experience of sublimity at the moment when it happens, which is overwhelming. It's God in His angry, it's infinity, and all the like look at the stars, middle of the desert or the ocean on the dark night, and it gives you that feels pretty big. But what we get in Katahdin is Thoreau's considered experience. And when he considers it, it turns to the reverential aspect. He says in the Katahdin essay, as they're coming down off the mountain in the boats, and he's amazed at the way people running the boats are able to pull down the rocks. And he says this is a mini Niagara. Niagara itself with them would be in danger of losing its sublimity. And he says that in losing their power to harness, they could lose their sublimity. Well, Niagara is the principal icon of the American sublime. So when Thoreau says, hey, let's not take this stuff too lightly, it's meant to overwhelm because without that experience, they lose their sublimity. And then if you pair that with the end of Cape Cod, where he's standing there looking out over the vast, infinitely deep expanse ocean. And he says that this is not Niagara, this is the waterfall where a man can go and stand with all of America.
Well, on that connection between terror and awe, there's a connection, I think, what we've been talking about, that I forget what the term that you were using for the word terror. You know, when you think about it, the word awe, awful, it combines both. I mean, it's used awful, it's bad. Awe, usually we think of it being positive. I've sort of gotten the habit of some of my students, I train them in this, and then if I tell them that their essay has been, it's an awful piece of writing, they know I mean awful, full long. Different little autos, great for the movements. And nature is holy mother, and that wonder and awe, but the curve, but all of it's terrific. Which brings me to Richard. Can we have experience of the luminous or the sublime with something that's not nature, like a locomotive? You know that talked earlier about Thoreau, or the locomotive factory you want to sell for. And it like he had some exalted feeling while he was doing.
I was just, you know, it's just the thing that came to mind when you asked, can we have the two? What I'm trying to put forth in this is we have no choice. When that thing starts, when the railroad starts, doesn't matter what's in front of it, doesn't matter what got run over, doesn't matter who died. And, you know, and these technologies, I think that's the point of this, is that once these technologies are underway, we have no choice as to whether we can have one or the others. That's what this problem sort of making sense.
I was thinking it's not, I've been making the case, this is the mountain, many people that go on to speak off. The road, epiphany there. Made his life and he saw God. Said that sublime peace and our connection. And so I back and regret gave it on so people may be out for a while and come apart. So a man doesn't meet the wilderness in the right unspoiled way. The fact that use that. Thoreau, he wasn't listed himself, but that was part of his connection to his it just opened people's minds and hearts to a bigger reality. Too. So we think
The published 1854 Walden, Thoreau was ambivalent about the railroad in various ways. He loved it and he hated it. The rest of his life, you know, I mean, did it go, I hate the railroad more and more, I like the railroad better and better.
I don't know, because out in Minnesota, is, he's relying on.
Yeah.
I mean, someone like Kathleen Smith or something, who dug into that specifically. I didn't cover any of that, what I'm feeling here.
There's a third possibility, and it just occurred to me. It's not that he hated it or liked it less, it's that his mood swung greater around that medium. So I think he really hated it at times. He loved it at times.
Says that this stuff just becomes, so it becomes this first, it's this overwhelming thing, like this, intrusive and all this. And also, it's just like, it's just what it is, it's like it's a part of our soundscape, landscape, landscape. I get that through the session, and then he writes about it too, like twice, not even that loud. So really, I just used to.
And for two, I think on the word, it was something it was all of the possible. Till that day, you're walking on that day, you're walking with you. And we're talking like 30 trips a day, and when the car was there, and like they said, no, you live town, it can then this guy has the other. Where helping build some of those beautiful grounds that we can really guys. Still to this day, we're arguing about way. It's yes, we public health is during some community work that we try to so this railroad stated this road that was about it, so we love it. It does continue throughout the holds all of these issues, and these come around again. That is real railroad. It's kind of like that, and we also argue about how long it was. So it's the thing that you and now that you did that and how you did.
Sure. I'm just thinking of Europeans, how come you guys didn't build more railroads? America doesn't have the right infrastructure for the railroads, right? Because we got cars, and so and people tell them we don't have enough railroads in the country. Yeah, for our population.
We have a question from the Zoom audience for Bill. Can you restate the three aspects of the sublime: vastness, solitude, and?
Well, it depends on who's listening. Vastness, solitude. Bert would say terror. Thoreau would put more emphasis on, but maybe I could say maybe terror is also part of it. But that would be those three, particularly terror, I think. Vastness. And basically, the underlying idea is just something overwhelming. And it has to be subjective as well as objective. May I say something about the personal experiences? Well, I mentioned if you sit down at dinner with me, I'll probably ask you what experience do you have with the sublime? And you can say, shut up, I got other things to think about. But one of the things I found most useful in my class to talk about, I've got a course on American wilderness and the way we experience wilderness. But I told a story of a time a few years ago when I was in the Grand Tetons, some of the grandest in America, and took a hike up into a couple miles off this lake bed on the mountains. And there was a gorgeous, beautiful waterfall, probably 20 or 30 feet wide and 100 feet wide, just magnificent. And I say beautiful and magnificent, and my brain is saying, yeah, But in the meantime, no impact whatsoever on me. And I had to reflect on it. There were 100 other people there, and somehow it just didn't work. The sublime is kind of elusive. But as I tell my students days later, I was sitting in my own backyard, and yonder up in the sky, way up there, there's this beautiful trail of a hawk just circling around. And I just suddenly felt, there are things we don't control. And that is, I think it's important to think of the sublime as objective triggers, but also the objective reactions. Sometimes a seemingly minor thing can produce that feeling, and a really major thing if it's not just the right circumstances.
If on the top contact, be like the premonition of space for other us. To me, it's if you had sort of an out of body experience. And as far as the trainings, really probably how if you struck amongst the train the kids are long. This is and there is a little broader if the trains were only per road, is a problem time.
Good. This is for Kathleen. You were talking about the provenance of the musket balls at the Concord Museum, and there's something being done about that. You may be familiar with the book that came out recently by Joel Bowie and Douglas Scott, Bullet Strikes from the First Day of the American Revolution, where they did this tremendous amount of detailed research in Concord and Lexington and Arlington on surviving buildings and objects that had bullet holes in them from April 19th, 1775. And they did all this, it was like police do forensic research when there's been a shooting. They analyze these bullet holes the same way. And I was very impressed with that they were able to do that. And I know the National Park has done a lot of research around musket balls that they have found related to April 1975. It's a subject that isn't all cut and dry. People are still figuring it out.
That's what it's the real findings. And I find so, I think there was a certain indifference that he had to the celebration of the Revolutionary War. And he didn't care if he really did find those. I imagine that he gave them to Ricketson, who was interested. And then at some point, Ricketson's children had them and then gave them to the museum, but there's no documentation for that.
And when Thoreau was like 8 years old, they drained the mill pond and found a bunch of stuff that the redcoats had thrown in the mill pond 50 years.
Well, if you watch people pull out the cannon, if you I think he mentioned found some muscle. I have a question for what would you say about that in the context of your big poetic?
So one of the things I'm thinking about is the moment that Thoreau was talking about contact. Actually, two things. One is we don't put that speech at the top of the mountain, it's in a bird descending. So there's this distance from Burke a little bit because the paradigmatic sublime encounter is, Percy Shelley and the great mountain speaker overwhelmed by me. And it's actually this delayed reflection that produces this what feels like most like a crisis of sort of overwhelm. And it's not happening in front of the mountains in the bird hands. And the thing you mentioned out of body experience, the thing you want to contact is we don't bow. We talk about I'm not afraid of the ghost spirit. I'm afraid of my own body, it's strange matter that I'm. That's also one of the things that I also teach Katahdin work. It's not a perfect working an exam because it's not this confrontation, it's confrontation with the alienness that things are. So that would be my entry, trying to think about the sort of balance. That we are, even as I sort of stress the pleasures of the body and the sensuous body, but it's also right? That we are in many ways sort of so dependent on the bodies that things and betray us as well. So the sort of recognition that you are this body that's also doesn't just sort of go your middle, be part of the terror that's registering there. But just thinking about how it's often sort of returning back to what does it mean to be a person with this sensuous life relationship to nature, the ultimate nature is what stuff that's all is where it's our answer to that question.
So I grew up in Buffalo, and so we spent years going up to Niagara Falls, Canadian side. Way before I knew anything about Sublime. Not Sublime. The whole tourist apparatus these days is so overwhelmed with falls that you can only, through the imagination, think about what it was like. First people who could hear the falls way before they arrived. First year meeting. And the best version of the fall is when they shut them off one year to clean up all the rubble at the bottom. That was the best time to go to the falls. Not Sublime, not anymore.
But I think looking at late, probably really always been good. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the idea of Sublime. In fact, I asked my expert friend to send me a copy of the paper. So I haven't read it yet. He's probably going to already prove me wrong. But as I think about Thoreau life, and I think about conflict, the more I explore the metaphors, the concept of conflict, and is sometimes cited by the 30s. It leads me to believe that probably part of the radical statement is Thoreau life is that we should survive. As he looks at himself, the world seems to
On trains, one of the discussions for content and report motorcycle. Never experience joy motorcycle. Motorcycles content is what the wheel goes to the ground. Way we turn, way we lead. Never experienced it. We should. It's not like a car. It's not like being converted. It's not like riding electric bicycle. It's a motorcycle. You'd be surprised at the reaction. I can imagine him screaming his lungs out.
Thank you, Kathleen, for mentioning the brief statement. And I've been captivated and Roseanne, the page would have been letters. I look at his surveys over and over again. He thinks some of them are geometric, some have this characteristic crochet and your pencil in your hand with paper you want to look at words.
shade. And I see I get ahead of seeing that drawing, I've seen others, it's. I get that thought. And I see his hand lovingly following that curve, you just age and feeling another form of sublime. And I wonder if he's felt some emotional reaction to his drawings similar to that.
To that particular drawing or all of them?
All of them did.
Oh, you're talking about in love with all of them.
Yeah, the sensuous.
Oh, yes, especially when you see them in the manuscript.
Yeah.
Because, in the printed editions, they're all set off. But when you see, all of that writing and then all of a sudden there's a drawing, it's just arresting. It's exhilarating in the manuscript. But I want to actually go back to something that you said today, because I was thinking about Thoreau's love of plays. And that's something that you discovered, you said, looking at his surveys. And so could you say what you said earlier about?
He did impossibly precise. All the engineers looked at it and said, couldn't. That's exactly. He had to be more precise than anyone. And he had to be precise because he was so enamored with the description of his role as someone who's in contact with land and providing something useful. But he would measure, for example, bearing it's not a stable measuring device, and it's gradated if you look at his compass museum to a half degree. He splits that early on, almost quarter degrees, and within months, he's at 8s, then he's at 7/8 minus. And from my experience as someone who deals with numbers in acoustics, that was like him expressing an angle in a sensory way. More like say,
So it's sort of love of land expressed through his kind of preciseness.
be precise.
Yeah, one thing that he did is he traced over Hale's map of thunder. And it's very light, except he adds certain elevations and he adds places where there are more woods in compared to what Hale's had. This is little choreographic drawings and some swamps. And again, I see that as trying to be precise. This is, Hale's didn't catch it all, but I'm going to capture it in my tracing.
It's supposed to talk about reality.
Isn't that what extravagant? So maybe there's another Thoreauvian paradox in extravagance and precision being somehow go together.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good question. If you take a car mile out from anything, but anyway. Yeah, I was a farmer. I lived within 5 feet. And I read, I'm trying to remember one of the some was commenting how accurate he could take off 15 blocks. That if he was no one around face.
But yeah, there were a few people that have spoken over the years on these, and something written in the Thoreau Society, the Society Bulletin, I would say it was like the December of 2018. I don't know, maybe, that we talk about his gait and how he had this perfect gait that was like a measuring stick. So I mean, how he could map out, oh, no, the bug's not there, Yeah, like who has?
We get time. Well, we are out of time, but we did come up and talk about it. Great questions. Reply.